My name's Debbie Wosskow and I'm a multi-exit entrepreneur. I've been building businesses for the last 25 years and I graduated from Oxford in 1995, a long time ago. So I studied philosophy and theology at New College, and it's an interesting one when you look back and think about that time. In a way, the subject matter, whilst really interesting, has been pretty irrelevant to my working life because nobody ever quizzes me about, Heidegger or Descartes' Cartesian circle in my work life. But I think my time at Oxford, the skill set of being able to read really quickly, which is one of my superpowers, and the tutorial system, which is much maligned in a lot of ways, but does give you some real practical skills in thinking on your feet, presenting, and probably a bit of swagger. So all of those things I think have been useful. I always talk about how your network is your superpower, and I think my network and building of networks definitely started at college, and I was quite a university person, so I did Charwell and I did lots of that sort of stuff, which I think was really relevant in terms of thinking through how you make connections in your career that can accelerate it. And the people that you grow up with, people I grew up with here, have been lifelong, not just friends, but allies and champions and investors, and that network was really important. So to students listening, it's not necessarily the content of the what, but I would say at this stage in your life, it's about figuring out what you're really good at. And my first job out of Oxford was a pretty standard Oxford job in management consultancy, which I wasn't very good at. And that, I think, is a brilliant experience for most people who come on this academic journey. They've been really good at school, they do well academically. I think doing something early in your career that you don't excel at is a really good life lesson for anyone. So when I'm talking to young people, to students, or to my own children, it's like, just pick the things you're good at and they give you joy and energy, and do more of them. When I think about what my why, I've had an unusual career. I've had an unusual career for a woman because we still have very few female entrepreneurs that get backed in the UK, and that's a big piece of the work that I've been doing over the last decade, is to get more female entrepreneurs funded. I think for me, some of it is exposure. So I grew up in a very entrepreneurial family. They would never have classed themselves as entrepreneurs because that was a very grand word, and the businesses were really humble. But I'm from an immigrant family where I didn't know anybody that had a job. I knew lots and lots of people that worked for themselves, and in particular, the women in my life. I'm from a vast, sprawling matriarchy of sort of proudly difficult women, and I think seeing that totally de-risked it for me. I also think starting your first business at 25, which I'm 50 now, 25 years ago, was still a reasonably unusual thing to do. I think now entrepreneurialism is more discussed at university, but when I graduated it certainly wasn't. If you were taking a certain track, you worked in banking or management consultancy or law or accountancy, or maybe advertising if you're a bit, jazzy, creative. I think it's shifting, but I think for me, what also happened, and sometimes environment drives this, and I think we see the same thing now with social media. When I set up my first business in 1999, that was .com1, and actually it was a time when youth and energy and understanding of new technologies was prized, so you were able as a young person to have credibility. I think we see the same wave now actually, because if I'm looking at my social media strategy for any of my businesses or what we do on TikTok, I'm unlikely to ask a 50-year-old to help me. So I think, it's environment, it's moment, and it's also a mantra that I've always had, which sometimes gets me into trouble, which is what's the worst that can happen? And I think at 25 the answer is not a lot, because you don't really have responsibilities, independence if it goes wrong. And I've always not been necessarily prepared to take risks, but I do take a swing at something. And I think taking a swing at something when you're young is a brilliant way to get started, because you can fail fast and you can change and you can pivot. All these words are a bit overused in business, but I think that they're real. And I think my time here and my early 20s really taught me about that. So I've done a lot of different things, and that's partly because I'm impatient and I get bored. So I have, I think, 5 or 6 years of anything in me. And that's partly because I'm a direct-to-consumer entrepreneur, which always means that I'm my own lowest cost of sales, right? So if you're a front person and you're telling a story, whether the story is about the movie The Holiday inspiring Love Home Swap, or like my last business being about building better networks for women in their careers, or the Better Menopause, my latest business, being about ensuring that women in midlife can feel like themselves again. You tell that story, you know, thousands of times, and you end up feeling like a stand-up comedian in need of some new material by the end. So that partly drives it. I think there's a red thread that makes sense to me, at least, which is I've been extremely focused on female economic empowerment. It really worries me that the data around female entrepreneurs getting funded and female investors investing and the gender pay gaps were getting worse in the UK. You know, we speak on the morning of Trump being elected in the US, and I think these topics are really live around women and money. And there's been no change during my business lifetime, and that's something that I really want to use my muscle to campaign around. When I think about the what, you know, what do I try to hold myself true to? What do I look for? Because I'm a prolific angel investor. I think about 3 Gs. The first of which is graft. I'm a northerner, not that you can tell from the accent anymore. And it's just really hard work. It's a lot of hours. It's a lot of hours in the early days. I think you can't underestimate how much work it actually is. So I think that matters. And the ability to work really hard generally comes from passion. So you really have to care about the thing. You really have to care about the narrative and the story that you're telling and the audience you're reaching, because if you're not super passionate about it at the beginning, it's going to get killed pretty fast. So I think graft is important. Grace, it's also the name of my daughter. Grace under pressure is really hard. It's the hardest thing actually, because we don't always feel graceful or gracious. And that's the thing I have to work on the most, and that's about networks and not burning bridges and treating people properly, even when you're fed up or you're over it or nobody's listening, you know, really figuring out, and I think I've grown into this over the years, how to bring people along with you. But the most important G is grit, and all of the data shows that grit trumps genius every day of the week. So we're speaking in Oxford where there are a lot of super smart people, and I've been book smart my whole life, but it's not the same thing, right? You know, you absolutely have to be tenacious, and you have to be able to pick yourself up off the floor. And I think some of these career stories look so effortless, and maybe mine does, you know, when you look at the exits and the gongs and all the rest of it, but it hasn't been. It's been unbelievably difficult. There have been days when I felt like giving up, weeks and months when I felt like giving up. But I think the difference between those who really succeed and those who don't is just their willingness to keep going. And I think that's the thing, that's the message for young people, that book smart is great, but you have to develop grit. And I think it's absolutely a muscle that you can work. I'm not sure people are really born with it, but tenacity and self-care also overused, and discipline. You know, I'm a disciplined person. For me, the absolute comfort in times of chaos, and in times of phenomenal chaos in my career, is routine. And I think that's how you do it. You've got to keep coming back to what you do to grind through really difficult times, and that's how you get through it. The other thing, there's some footage somewhere of Tom Hanks talking about this, that I think a great life mantra is "this too shall pass." When things are awful and you can't, and it's "this too shall pass." When things are amazing and you're on top of the world and you're smashing it, "this too shall pass," right? So I think it's that. I think recognising, and there's something about aging that really gives you a sense of it, that life is clearly peaks and troughs, but it's how you deal with you. That's the only thing you can control. There are lots of stats around female entrepreneurship, and I'm the co-chair of the Investing Women Task Force, where our Our champion is Rachel Reeves, our first female Chancellor and also a fellow New College alumni. Yes, there are more female entrepreneurs in the UK, but the bad news is that in the main those businesses are tiny and female founders are not getting funded. So in the first half of 2024, the amount of capital going to back a female-led business went down to 1.8%, whilst the amount of money going to back a business co-founded by two men went up to 86%. So 86% of all capital went to back a business with no women in the cap table. So I'm afraid it is depressing, and there are a number of things that drive this, I think. My role as chair of the task force is to get more money in female hands. I think that all of the data shows that female investors are twice as likely to back a female founder as a male investor. And that isn't just egregious sexism, it's pattern matching, particularly post-COVID when, I think COVID has been unbelievably unkind to women's careers. I really worry about flexible work and work from home putting women back in the kitchen. I think we need to be in the room, we need to be visible, but we need more female investors. So the Invest in Women Task Force job, my job, is to create the biggest funding pot in the world to back female investors with a mandate to back women-led and mixed teams. So none of this is anti-men, men are very welcome, but they've got to have a female co-founder in order to be funded by the task force capital pot. I think that's the only way that we have a generational shift in wealth allocation, because unless we have a direct intervention, then status quo shows that women aren't getting bet. So I have raised hundreds of millions of pounds worth of capital. That is extremely unusual as a female entrepreneur. And without capital, businesses don't scale. There are some green shoots. So reasons to be cheerful are way more 16 to 24-year-old women are founding businesses. And I think that's partly because of social. And I think and hope when I talk to really young women, as I did recently in my daughter's school, when you ask them if they want to be or define as entrepreneurs, nobody puts their hand up. If you ask them who's selling stuff on Depop, everybody puts their hands up, right? And that makes them an entrepreneur. So I think some of that's a shift. The other reason to be cheerful is women in midlife. And I think that's also partly one of the positive consequences of the pandemic. And in my Albright life, we saw that from our community, that as they came out of the pandemic, they didn't want to go back to working in big corporates or for other people. There was a real sense of wanting to control their own destiny. So if I look at the stats of women in midlife, they're also concerning. 25% of women in the UK want to leave the workforce because of their menopause symptoms, 10% actually do. So I see my role, self-appointed but also politically appointed, to keep women working. It's hard enough to stay in. Women's careers are not linear. At the time, if you have kids, when you have kids, that's a difficult time. I don't want women leaving in their 50s because they're not handling their menopause properly and they're not getting the help they need. Hence, I'm the co-founder of the Better Menopause, which exists to ensure that women feel like themselves again. So we create science-driven supplements with doctors that make you feel better. So throughout, I think the picture is depressing, but I think that intervention can drive change. And I want the UK to be the best place in the world to be a female entrepreneur, and that takes work. I think for female entrepreneurs, there's a series of different barriers. The mean age to start a business in the UK is 33, and that's often when women are having children or have young families. There's just some practical stuff, like if I look at my businesses, for years in the business I didn't earn any money, and that's reasonably standard. If you're growing a business and scaling a business, you're either redeploying profits back into the business or you're raising capital. And the only reason I could found Love Home Swap was because I'd had my first exit before I had my kids. So there's some structural issues. I think we need more female role models. There still aren't enough women who have done it, that talk about doing it. We need women to get rich, and we need them to talk about money, and they need to deploy their capital in backing other women. That's what men have been doing for years, right? So that's why I angel invest, and particularly in young female founders, because they need that access and they don't always have their networks if they're getting going at the age that I got going, 25. But I think it's capital, it really is, and that means the work that I'm doing for the task force to create a funding pot, signposting for female entrepreneurs to angel investment syndicates, and ensuring that women have more money in their hands. The gender pay gap begets the gender savings gap, right? We've just got less money. So across the piece, economic empowerment of women is what erodes some of the barriers faced by female entrepreneurs. It's a massive historic issue. And again, when I look back on my childhood, it was unusual in that the women in my family ran the money, and they worked and ran businesses and were mothers. I think I just thought that was normal. And then it wasn't until I got into the world of work that I realised it wasn't. So I think that's right. Of course, there's years of convention. My generation is really the first generation of women where it's absolutely been the norm to have careers, so we're coming from behind. But I think that entrepreneurialism and an entrepreneurial career has been the great joy of my life. It's also been the hardest thing, the worst thing. I'm going to be realistic about what it's like and what it takes. But I don't want women to feel like it's not for them simply because they're women. And that, I think that's really important, because it can deliver life-changing wealth. You know, we need to get comfortable with talking about that. A lot of women are still very uncomfortable talking about money. And with wealth comes options, you know, optionality about how you live your life, where you live your life, the choices you make, how you give back. That stuff's really important. But women haven't been at the table. They need to be. So resilience for me is about routine, and I have my own version of it, which might not be to everybody's taste, but I get up early, I exercise every single day, I get outside in the air, I lift heavy weights, you know, I do stuff that makes me feel physically strong. And I feel much physically stronger now than I did in my 20s, where no one in their 20s is investing in all of that, right? We're just doing what we're doing. So I think that has been really important to me. I think also getting out of your head, because I think we're always on with phones and life, and you know, I've always run international businesses, so there's always someone wanting to get hold of you. So I think figuring out where your joy comes from, that's my big, in my year of being 50, that's my big thing, more joy. And so for me, it's theatre and books, it always has been, you know, so making time for that. I try to go to the theatre once a week. Nobody can get to me, my phone's off, and I'm taking myself out of myself. I find that really helps actually with perspective. Perspective is the really important thing, and that comes from having a great network of people that you can take the mask off with. I think it's hard. I started doing what I do at a really young age, where I was faking it really. You know, if you're 25 and you've got a big company suddenly of people who are generally a lot older than you have to have a mask on. I think finding your tribe, many of whom actually are women that I was at Oxford with, who have gone on to have successful careers, where you can be really candid and say, this is awful, this isn't working, I screwed this up, what do you think? I think that's the really important part of resilience. So it's routine, it's getting out of yourself, and it's finding your tribe. So I only back women. I think it's really important that I put my money where my mouth is, and women generally undersell. So, you know, I've been on the receiving end of so many pitches from, you know, all sorts of different people, different businesses. Women tend to undersell, and they're not as confident with their numbers as men are. So I think you really need to be ready. You need to be ready to sell the dream and back it up. You need to be super fluent with the maths, and you know, we sort of see that, don't we, when we watch Dragon's Den, but it's true. And I think also network, by which I mean I tend to invest alongside other people. That's how I see deals. It's generally harder for a woman to have that network. It's not as inbuilt as it is for men. So I think specific asks of busy people tend to be met with a response. If anybody ever messages me, so I have a sort of LinkedIn drumbeat and says, can I pick your brains? I just, you know, like there's there's no brain to be picked. If somebody says, I see you're connected to X and I'm doing Y, could you connect me? That's easier for me. So I think be really specific when you want help. I think my network's one of my superpowers, and you will not build your network in your kitchen. So you need to show up. You know, a lot of what Albright was about was no woman in the history of the world has ever gone, brilliant, I'm going to a networking event, I don't know anyone and I can't wait for the warm wine and canapes. You know, you just, like, everyone's heart sinks when you walk into a room full of strangers, but you have to do it and you have to have something to say. So, and your confidence comes from practicing, hi, I'm Debbie Wosskow and this is what I do, what do you do? You know, what's keeping you awake at night, what are you interested in, or finding ways to make connections. So you have to be in the room. I think in the last 5 years, LinkedIn has become an amazing place to build networks. I post on LinkedIn 5 times a week. It's a content platform. So when I'm speaking to younger people, make sure that you're really investing in that, because that allows you to connect with people you don't know and ask for things or ask for connections. And I get an awful lot of incoming, which I can't quite manage, but again, if something specific, I'll try to. I think also be really broad, and sitting here back in Oxford, a lot of my network's been my network for years. So when you're a mini entrepreneur or a mini journalist or a mini writer or a mini, you're going to grow up, right? So a lot of the people now who are super important have been people that I've known for a really long time. So I think keeping in touch and keeping close to people really matters. I think also for women and women listening, there are a lot of women's spaces where you can build out your network of other women. And of course, broad networks are really important, but I have found those networks to be really powerful. So seek those out. Yeah, I mean, I've never had a formal mentor-mentee relationship. I've had some amazing and awful, actually, people in the mix over the years. And they have been my chairman, they've all been men, actually, my investors who have mostly been men. So in all of this, you know, I always say that a big part of the reason for my career success is that I'm really good at asking men for money. And if I wasn't, I wouldn't have had a career, because investors are men. The charitable work that I do, whether that's for theatre or the Women's Prize for Fiction, I fundraise a lot, again, generally from men. So all of those things really matter. I had a brilliant chairman in my Love Home Swap business who I'm still very close to, and again, he is someone that I would go to with specific problems to solve. So I think that mentorship thing is important. I do an advisory role for 2 female COOs stepping up to be CEOs in private equity-backed businesses. I love doing that because a lot of what they're grappling with is a combination of real life sales business model challenges and how to deal with mostly male rooms. I think I can help there. So I think I've never had one person, I've had a sort of smorgasbord of different people, and I think again that's part of having a broad network. Culture's everything. And I've created some complicated cultures. So Albright was a 96% female workforce, which was amazing and super challenging, you know, because there are lots of consequences to do with women's careers not being linear, women's fertility journeys. That means that you're dealing with a lot of different things. Albright was also complicated because we employed lots of different types of people. We had baristas in physical spaces in America, and we had digital creators, and we had marketeers, and we had finance. It's really hard. But I think, it sounds trite, but communication is everything. I've always erred on the side of being over-communicating, being super transparent. And I think there's always a pivot point where you go from being a really small team to a bigger team. But I've just got better at doing. 30 people is the tipping point where you don't know everybody's name, you don't know their, you know, family situation and what they like to do for fun. And I think building out culture at stages to be communicative and inclusive, but also commercial. You know, my charitable life is my charitable life. My businesses are there to make money, and they generally combine purpose with profit, and that's quite a difficult one to pull off, because you can't, if you were too far on the purpose side, then the commercial suffer. If you're too much on the commercial side, the purpose can drift. So I think keeping everybody honest is the CEO founder's job. Yeah, so I think I've never had work-life balance. I think it's unbelievably hard as an entrepreneur and as a mother, and I was a single mum when my kids were 3 and 1. What I've tended to aim for is work-life blend, and I think there's a few factors. It meant that when my children were little, they're now 16 and 14, so it's a bit more manageable, I would bring them with me. I think as a founder, as a CEO, as a woman, you can set culture actually and get away with a lot more. So when I was, closing a deal and I had a child in the pram, I think the lawyers, raised eyebrows, but I'm the boss, what they're going to do, kind of thing. So I think I always did that. I think the children have therefore had an unconventional life to the extent that they've been around work a lot. But that notwithstanding, I think that the other point that's really important to make is I've always had help, and I'm not sure that we talk about that enough. I had a nanny who lived in until the kids were teenagers, really, and without that it would not have been possible to travel. I put myself under a lot of pressure, probably, and when I look back on that time, particularly those Albright years, I went to the US every other week, and I did one night there and one night on the plane. That was pretty grim, to be honest, and it did make me burn out. I don't love the word, but I've talked about a lot. I got very sick when I was 48, and I just think years of pushing it too hard, not prioritising my own health, undersleeping, overworking, overflying. I just flew too much. So I think you have these moments when you reappraise. For me, my business ideas and the way that I work have always come out of crisis, probably. Partly because work's always been my great salvation. When the world around you is disintegrating, I always long for the kind of calm of the office, to be honest. And I think there's a real point there about prioritising what gives you energy and what you're good at. I think we get a lot of our energy from feeling like, okay, I'm good at this, and I'm good at work, and I like solving problems at work. Just because I'm good at work doesn't mean it's always effortless. It's not. Sometimes it's a disaster. But I think even disastrous work times give you a real sense of purpose, and I think that's what life's about. So work-life balance, I don't know. I mean, show me a female entrepreneur and I'll show you someone whose life is not in balance. But a blend and an aim and a growing into different choices, and that's also why women need to make money, because my career choices now are choices. My career choices 15 years ago had to be really financially driven because, there were just realities about life. So I think balance is hard. Blend we can get to the 3 legs of the stool, which are, work and family and health. They're not always all on the floor at the same time. It's indisputable that women bear more of the mental load of the house and the family than men. Every data set shows that. Plus, without sounding too kind of Meghan Markle, the lived experience of my peers means that that's mostly what we talk about. My experience of it has been different because it's been me and the children, on my own. Although that has a series of all of its own consequences, it's just structurally harder to do it as a woman. So you have to choose your partner well, and you've got to have a lot of these conversations up front about how the mental load is split. But I think it's just hard. The flip of it is then to be positive. I think if you want something doing, give it to a busy woman, right? And I think when I look around at my peers, who are extraordinary women, not just entrepreneurs, but women doing all sorts of interesting things. They're just superheroes, they're unbelievably efficient. and they're brilliant at managing the different responsibilities in their life. Of course, it shouldn't have to be like that, and I hope it is starting to change, but I think it is just much harder. The list is long. I think to my younger self it would be to not worry so much about being liked. I think that's a really difficult thing, particularly for young women, that we like to be liked. And I think if you're a boss, age 25, where you don't really know what you're doing, so I didn't, and you're learning on the job and you're responsible for lots of people's livelihoods, not everyone's going to like you. The beautiful thing about getting older is you just stop giving a shit. So I think you focus much more on relationships and networks and doing the right thing. I think you're much better at delivering bad news, and you're much better at facing up to some of the difficult consequences of decisions and delivering unpalatable messages. That is so hard in your 20s. You just don't know how to do it. The first time I ever sacked someone, it took me sort of 3 hours and I was in tears. You know, you just get, it's not that you get more ruthless, you just get more experience. I think you get more pragmatic. So my younger self really, really cared about that. I had quite a thin skin. Anna, my Albright co-founder, and I always say to each other, Rhino hide, you know, as a sort of chapter in the book that we wrote in 2019, because I think you can develop it. But I think as a young woman, that was really hard. I mean, legacy is such a grand word, isn't it? I think, you know, the reason it's my second government review, which shows I need my head really looking at. I think you do these things which are of course unpaid, and you're hoping to deliver something that actually that drives change, is around the ecosystem and the experience for female entrepreneurs being profoundly different from where it was when I started in 1999. I think I've got a part to play and some profile and a reasonably sort of vocal personality and a decent network is to try and drive that change. And I think also for younger women to look at me and others, but to hear me and think, if she can do it, I can do it. So that when I speak to my daughter and her peers, they've got many more options, and they've got options to be economically independent of men. I don't think anything good happened to women where they need men for money in their lives. I think that we need to be able to make our own choices and to forge our own path. And sitting here in Oxford, where there are so many clever, amazing young women, I want to make sure that they've got that option.